In this podcast, we'll be talking about history as a neurodivergent community from the period of the early 20th century through to the 1960s. And this includes talk of the Second World War, Nazis, the Holocaust, and many more upsetting themes. I would not knowingly share this information with you if I didn't strongly believe in order to understand where we are as a community, we need to understand our shared history. As ever, there are some light and wholesome moments, and as always, we hold space with warmth. We can't account for everyone's trauma and what people might find jarring. But in these next few episodes, it is likely to be jarring. So if you need to listen at another time, if you need to hit the pause button, get a cup of tea. Whatever you need to do for your own self-care, now's that time. Welcome to Neurotypicals Don't Juggle Chainsaws, the podcast that cuts through the rubbish to explore the world of neurodiversity. I'm your host, Nick King.
And I'm your host, Kate Fox. And together we're here to explore, understand and celebrate being neurodivergent in a neurotypical world. From ADHD and autism to dyslexia and other quirky brains, we talk about it all.
And go off on tangents. So whether you're neurodivergent, love someone who is, or you're just curious about neurodivergent minds, you are in the right place.
Let's get ready to juggle some words and maybe even a few chainsaws, metaphorically, of course. Welcome to a very exciting edition of Neurotypicals Don't Juggle Chainsaws. I still find it really hard to say the title of our own podcast. I'm Kate Fox. We also have Nick King, as usual, because we're the co-hosts. But today, we have a special guest. We have a guest. And he is a very, I want to say a big cheese. I'm really sorry. I don't know where that phrase has come from. It just came into my head. Big cheese? What do I mean in the autistic community? Nick, before we actually hear from Kieran Rose, the man himself, could you tell us a little bit about him and why you said we have to get this man on this podcast?
Oh, because I like him. No, Kieran is my good friend, and it is an honour to work with him on the regular. And we've worked together for a long time, and we have a lovely special relationship, and I know he knows a huge amount about our history as autistic people, and I love listening to him talk about it, and I was desperate to share that with our audience. Kieran, I'm sure you have a proper official introduction, I'm sure.
I do, but I don't really know how to follow that now. I feel like you two are just juggling chainsaws while you're talking.
How it works.
Or juggling, Kate. That's a new word. Juggling, Kate. Chainsaws. That's I really enjoyed that. And that's a word we should all be using. So hi. I am Kieran, and I am an autistic man. I do lots of research. I'm an author. I do writing. I do training. I consult to different organizations all over the world. And really what I try to do is kind of help people to deconstruct a lot of the narratives around us so that then they can put them back together in a more useful and productive way for all of us, because those narratives are so dehumanizing and stigmatizing and cause us lots of problems. So that's me.
Fabulous. And we know you have specialist topics. We all know that you talk about masking, but I think less people know that you have a significant and in-depth interest in our history.
It's weird to say that I absolutely adore looking into the history of autism because I do, but it's quite awful in so many different ways. And so it's a weird thing to say that I adore doing, but it is something I spend. The history of autism and the history of psychology and psychiatry, they're kind of all wrapped up together. And so it's an extreme kind of interest of mine. You can see a minimal number, although over that side, minimal number of my books, if I don't know if this is going out as a video as well. But yeah, some of my books are there, but literally this whole wall is plastered with not only psychology books and books about the history of autism, but books by autistic people all through the years as well, going back to the kind of 1980s and things as well. So all of that all wrapped up together, it just fascinates me.
And I think a lot of people don't know that, do they? They don't understand that autism, because there is a narrative, isn't there? Oh, autism's new, everyone's got autism these days, it's fashionable, it's popular. Some awful framings around that. But when did our history start? Is that a good starting point? Should we go back 100 years?
Yeah. About 120 years actually, all the way to Switzerland, with a man called Paul Eugene Bleuler, who was at that point constructing the diagnostic construct of schizophrenia. And autistic psychopathy was something that he identified as a part of schizophrenia. He came up with the term autism. And really what it meant then was, as an aspect of schizophrenia, that he decided that schizophrenic people had this very rich inner world that was more attractive to them than the outside world, which prevented them from accessing the world outside of their heads. And then that evolved over time as different people kind of took that notion of autism, of the self, and really kind of ran with it in a few people ran with it in a few different directions, and some of those people are quite problematic.
Can I ask about because I know of Bleuler through his kind of pre-Freud days, and we then know that lots of the early patients that they were seeing at that time were kind of, well, my perception has been middle class women, but that's not who Bleuler was seeing, was it? Who was he seeing? And would we now perceive them as what we would see as autistic people?
Yeah, I think predominantly he was seeing it was men he was predominantly seeing, first of all, and not middle class men. It was predominantly working class people. So, and there is unfortunately, I hate using this term because Nick shouts at me every time I mention Nazis, but there is very much a eugenics narrative running. Bleuler was a eugenicist, and what that means is people who feel that people who don't present in the way that a very particular set of society, so middle class, white, academic, kind of straight men, who don't like how other people exist in the world, and then want to breed that out of the population, basically, so that everybody looks like a white middle class man, or at least exists through that kind of lens and that narrative. So yeah, they're the people he was predominantly working with, and I think it really kind of sets the tone for future work. That he's already identified a group of people who he perceives as being a problem, and then wants to resolve that by identifying it even more strongly, so we can say this person is a problem. Let's make sure that they don't become a breeding part of the population and perpetuate that problem forward. But definitely, I think, Kate, I think that's a really important point, that I would say, looking back historically, the number of people that he was looking at, he was probably looking at neurodivergent people more broadly, but definitely autistic people would have been a part of that cohort too. And that's the problem with a lot of these constructs, is that they all overlap so much with each other, don't take into account context. The context that Bleuler had was very minimal. The context we have today is much broader in terms of intersections and things. And so we've created these boxes that we're still using today, but aren't fit for purpose in lots of ways, and then cause us more problems. So yeah, really pertinent question.
Okay, if I'm going to let you do Nazis and labels and boxes, do we want to talk about where these boxes were first created and why, and how a lot of the autistic community are against labels like high and low functioning?
Okay. So for that, really, that's a broader part of the disability narrative. So the way that mental health and disability was being looked at through that kind of eugenics ideal, which was very, very strong at the beginnings of the 20th century and running through, well, as we well know, through the 1930s and 1940s. And even to this day, it's still a very prevalent narrative now. It's just not maybe as obvious as it was back then. But the person that we really have to kind of, I'm not sure if thank is the right term, the person we have to blame for that high and low functioning narrative being part of the autism narrative is really Asperger. because he had a cohort of children that he was working with through the 1930s. Actually, maybe I need to mitigate that. We don't know whether Asperger was a Nazi. He never signed up to the Nazi Party. There's no evidence of that. But we do know he joined fascist groups at the beginnings of the 1930s. He was a nationalist in Austria, and worked very, closely, had very close ties with the Nazi Party, and was at times told to dial things back because he was too much of a Nazi in some of the things that he was saying, which made it look like he was overcompensating. So we know that there's that, again, that very prevalent narrative running through there. But he had a cohort of kids that presented in lots of different ways. And looking back, we can say that there were kids that were very academic. There were kids that maybe retrospectively we would identify as having intellectual or learning disabilities. There were children that had physical things going on. So a very mixed group. I mean, he recognized the common thread amongst all those children, which is ironic now because there's, again, a push to kind of start separating autistic people again into different groups. But he actually really recognized that there was this common thread of autistic psychopathy, as he terms it, running through these children who presented in similar ways despite their differences. But we also know that he matched up with the Nazi ideology that some people were good for society and were going to input in society and be productive for society, and some people were not. And then we had a problem with those people, and they were given that kind of burden narrative. So we know in 1938 he spoke at a Nazi Party conference and described the children that were going to go on to become the academics and the engineers and the mathematicians and the scientists that were going to be useful for the Third Reich. And then he described the children that were not going to go on to become those things, that he described as being a burden. And we know that those children were moved from his clinic and moved to other clinics where awful things were done to them. So that's that beginning of that high functioning and low functioning narrative. And it really is a very capitalist theme in terms of productivity, and you are useful, you will be able to pay taxes, you will be able to do something which is good for society, and other people not being seen through that lens. So they're worthless to a degree. That's the kind of label that they were given. So that's really the root of that, and that narrative has been perpetuated forward in terms of this high functioning and low functioning kind of labeling. And we also know that there are prominent researchers today who have echoed the work of Asperger in the things that they've said. I don't know if you're going to let me name names today, and certain people who are still around today, who have literally said exactly the same things as Asperger in reference to different groups of autistic people and in the justification of their work. So it's not something that's ever gone away. It's just become a little bit more subliminal.
When I was, and this is such important context, isn't it? And as you say, lots of people don't know this history. I was just quite moved when you said our history, and I've never been in a group of 3 autistic people and it's been recognised as our history. Oh, that gave me the feels. In my research around Asperger, I know that he did, there was some young women in his clinic, some girls. And one of the things around them not being productive enough to be in the German Volk was possibly they were not going to be very good at keeping house or having children, and therefore they were not okay, and we should dispense with them. And I know because the narrative then was so male for so long after that, it feels important that nonetheless he was recognizing young women, even if only to basically condemn them to death, essentially.
Yeah, and it is so important. The thread of, there are threads of obviously ableism, but sexism and racism are right through. If it was like a stick of rock and you could break it open, those 3 words would be at the heart, written through the entire autism narrative. That different people were seen through different groups of people were seen through different lenses, and women and girls were, you're absolutely right, Kate, were seen through that lens and were, for want of a better phrase, disposed of because they weren't seen as that was their role in society at the time. And that's also another important thing to think about here, because this foundation of autism, this is the stuff that's still referenced today. Everything we know about autism is built on the work of essentially 3 or 4 people who were male, were essentially white, were academic, middle class, straight. And thinking about the context of the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, how different groups of people were viewed by those people, you know, there's a whole privilege narrative running through this as well as that core of ableism and racism and sexism, and it's, if everything we know is built on that, then not only is all of that problematic, it's all, I like to term it as a foundation of sand as well. Because if we know that the foundation of autism was not built on intersection and intersectional identities, then it's not worth anything, really. Objectively, it's really not worth anything at all, because it's just an observer view, and it's an observer view from a very thin slice of human experience. And it's a human experience that has all the power, and it still has the power today predominantly. And that's where the problem lies. And it creates so many issues and barriers for so many of us. And, you know, as three white people sitting here, we have so much more privilege than so many other groups and members of our community. And it's so important to address that, and address that historically as well, and to make people aware of that.
Want to help keep our podcast going strong, a bit like my coffee? You can leave a tip via our PayPal link on our website, Neurotypicals Don't Juggle Chainsaws, and your support keeps everything running smoothly, again like my coffee, and we couldn't do it without you. Yeah, I think we do a lot of recognising our privilege, and we'll do continually, and hopefully time is a thing. And I think people don't realize how long the timeline has been, and how lots of ideas have come and some have gone, and then some still perpetuate in the sort of like the high functioning sort of model. When you were talking about women not being adequate to be mothers, I was thinking about Bruno Bettelheim and his refrigerator mother theory. And I know we have the privilege to know somebody who was directly linked to that and has like a direct family member within that. When I deliver training in other areas, I don't do it dismissively at all, or even jokingly. I do it because I want them to constantly put it in their head, and I sing "We Don't Talk About Bruno" to them. Because I want that to stick, because we still have a huge parent blame narrative. We still have a huge mother blame narrative. We are still telling mothers that they are not good enough for their autistic children. Would you like to talk about Bruno?
I could talk about Bruno for months. Out of all the people that have had an influence over us historically, he is probably, in terms of the UK, he's probably the least well known when people mention that name. But he has had not only a direct influence on us, but many people who are indirectly or directly affected by the diagnostic constructs in the DSM. He's had an influence over many of that, and also therapeutic practice in terms of psychotherapy and psychiatry has had an enormous influence over that too. So Bruno, as everybody who seems to be involved in the autism narrative, came from Vienna. Everybody comes from Vienna, and so he was interred in a Nazi concentration camp for about 10 months at the end of the 1930s, and was released as part of an amnesty for Hitler's birthday randomly, and managed to get out of Austria and get out of Europe, and ended up in the US at the end of 1939. And when he arrived in the US, I think there was very much a thought within him that, you know, I'm in this new world. There's no way that anybody can look into my history and my past. I can beat anybody right now. And he'd always had an interest in psychotherapy, had gone under some psychotherapy sessions himself. So he turned himself into Dr. Bruno Bettelheim, said that he trained under Freud, had worked with the Viennese Psychotherapy Society, and so embellished this story of his kind of history of curing autistic children pre-war and during his time in the concentration camp as well. And so this gave him a reputation already that other people were latching onto and kind of going, oh, wow, you must be some amazing physician and psychiatrist. So he was given a role as the director of what's called the Orthogenic School in Chicago in Illinois. And within that school, over the period of about 20 to 25 years, lots of children came through under his stewardship, and lots of not great things happened to those children. And out of that, what was driving him was this notion that, and actually he compared the experiences of being autistic and living at home with parents as being a Jewish person in a concentration camp. So he conflated those experiences with parents set up as the Nazi commandants, as the overseers, overlooking the people within the camp. And the narrative that he came from was that the Nazis didn't show any love, respect, or empathy for the Jewish people that they were imprisoning. And so parents, particularly mums, were also showing no love, empathy, or any kindness towards their children. So the children felt like they weren't wanted. And what kind of fed this was, you can imagine, particularly at the time, the way that autistic people were being identified was very much the kind of learning disability and physical disability narrative. That was the narrative of autism at the time, solely that, thanks to Leo Kanner. And so there were lots of parents who were absolutely distressed, did not know how to meet the needs of their children, were not supported in any way, shape, or form. So there's very much a narrative of parents who felt like they wanted to take their own lives, felt like their children would be better off if they weren't alive. And he used that and twisted that to become basically that mothers didn't love their children enough, and that's why their children were autistic. That they were just parents that wanted their children not to be alive, so therefore they hated them. So there's a twisted logic within all of that. And it's really weird because when you look at Bettelheim's thinking, and you know, I've gone back and looked up so many like interviews. There's still video recordings of interviews with him. I've got literally a wealth of all of his books over here that I've soaked myself in. And there's grains of kind of weird truth within some of the stuff that he writes about. He's picking up on something, but the way he's twisted it, possibly through his own trauma, possibly through maybe his own neurodivergence as well. You know, we can look back and retrospectively look back at a lot of these people and say, probably you were one of us, unfortunately. But the way that he's twisted those things is disgusting. And the impact that he has had directly on families and the children that he worked with, and also on the narrative, the indirect impact on parents, on families, on us as autistic people, is very much prevalent. And we still have a fabricated and induced illness narrative in the UK particularly, which is very, very prevalent, which is where mums basically are effectively blamed for making up their children's behavioural problems, or it's because they're not good enough parents, they don't have boundaries. And local authorities latch onto that. There's no evidence base for that for all, but that all comes from Bruno Bettelheim's work, who was a fraud. And, you know, that's not spoken about enough.
And it's astonishing when you hear it so starkly like that. And he's responsible, isn't he, for the phrase refrigerator mother,
Yeah.
which, because that's such a powerful image as well, isn't it? Oh, the mother who is cold, who is inaccessible, but also for the image of the empty fortress, I believe was the title.
Yeah, that's the title of one of his books, and that's one of his ideologies, yeah.
And the idea, so that is, and that, so there's something going on outside, but there's nothing happening inside. Or an autistic person, in fact.
Yeah.
And it's striking me, and it just, so many of these narratives are about a terrible, as you say, a twisting of what's happening inside somebody, and a lot of assumptions are made. So either there's, oh my God, so much is going on inside this person, they're like not in touch with reality, it's just so much, or it's there's nothing going on inside this person, they're completely empty, they're inaccessible. And it seems to me we're still stuck in these narratives of inside versus outside, and
an observation.
Yeah. As a society.
It is. It's what Nick describes as an observational model all the time, and it really is. It's an outside perspective, looking at someone, comparing that person to yourself, and then saying you're not right. You've got deficits in being me, and so therefore there's something wrong with you. You look different to me, so therefore I'm going to make judgments about you. And when we've got this huge power dynamic of again, going back to that white middle class academic kind of, there is a huge power narrative there, and you're looking at people who don't fit that narrative and comparing them against you, and the way that you behave, the way you think, the way you feel, the way you emote. Every aspect of being autistic is up for correction or pathologization in some way, and all of that is a comparison model based on observation. And it's that notion of the empty fortress, I mean, we were talking about children. That's all they were talking about then. They weren't talking about adults. And they never conceived that autistic children grew up into autistic adults at all. But this notion that autistic children were empty, that's Bettelheim's narrative. But Bettelheim was also anti-behaviorist, which is really interesting because that was the empty fortress was the same narrative that was being picked up by behaviorists as well. So Ivor Lovelace, who was the kind of the founder of ABA, that was very much his narrative as well, that autistic children were empty and needed to be molded and shaped through behavioral correction into the human being that we wanted them to be. Whereas Bettelheim's ideology was autistic children are empty and needed to be molded and shaped by filling them up with childhood, which he felt that they didn't have. So Bettelheim's children that he worked with, even teenagers, were being forced to sing nursery rhymes and play with very, very kind of baby-oriented toys and things like that. He restarted their childhood in the therapy. Therapy is a very loose term here. The intervention that he was using with them, feeling like if he could give them something that they had been denied from his perspective, then they would morph into these characters that could integrate into society much better. And all of it is coming from this place of we're empty and soulless and emotionless, almost like we're made of clay, that other people have the right to shape us into what they want us to be. And that's so dehumanizing.
I'm thinking Frankenstein at this moment, almost. He becomes a Frankenstein figure. I know that we only have 4 minutes left of this podcast episode, and I feel like there's quite a lot more history to touch on, which is why it's a very good job that this is going to be a 3-parter. A little bit of me would love you, Nick, to sing "We Don't Talk About Bruno." Cheer us up a moment from all the trauma. I'm not sure if that's an appropriate place to end, but possibly it might be, actually. But where will we throw forward to then? What happened after Bruno?
Doesn't really get
what happened after Bruno?
Better, does it?
A part 2 of a Disney story. I mean, we could go to Disney times. We are moving on to sort of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. We can go to the start of Disney. There is no autistic Disneyland to this day, and there was not then either. But
there is Artscape, which is kind of autistic Disneyland, the retreat for autistic people, in a kind of mini sort of way. Will we talk about Lorna Wing as well?
We can talk about Lorna, absolutely. I think what's really important to know here is that as we get through into the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the context changes. It doesn't mean that it's an enormous amount better, but the kind of the harmful things we leave in, the really harmful things we leave in the past, and then we move into a kind of a section where people are coming up with much more progressive work, which now we look back and think, oh, this could have been a whole lot better. Had you thought about things differently, and again, thought about intersections and things, but there is a big step into an improvement, which isn't great. But then maybe in the 3rd part, we'll get onto the bit where actually there is a real game-changing kind of move in it, and things start progressively getting better. Okay. So we're getting to the middle ground, maybe, Kate, if that makes sense.
Middle ground. Okay, dear listener, we promise you 30 minutes. We stick to 30 minutes. Join us for part 2. Thanks for tuning in to Neurotypicals Don't Juggle Chainsaws. We're so glad you joined us today to explore the fascinating world of neurodivergence with your hosts, me, Nick King.
And me, Kate Fox. If our conversation sparked a thought, a question, or even a smile, don't keep it to yourself. Drop us a line at hello@neurotypicalsdon'tjugglechainsaws.co.uk or visit our website, neurotypicalsdon'tjugglechainsaws.co.uk, to write in. We'd love to hear from you.
If you enjoyed today's episode, consider leaving us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast platform.
Until next time, keep embracing the unique ways you juggle the chainsaws of life.
We hope you enjoyed the time we spent with Kieran Rose, the autistic advocate. And if you want to know more from Kieran's perspective, he has an amazing course called The Inside of Autism, available from his website, theautisticadvocate.com, in which he covers many topics in depth, including our history. As ever, if you want to share your thoughts about a podcast, please get in touch at neurotypicals don't juggle chainsaws.co.uk.